Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is my second sermon from Genesis 18, verses 16 to 33. Today, we're going to be going over the narrative for Abraham interceding for Lot, and more so, Abraham interceding for the city of Sodom as God is planning on destroying that city. And so, we're just going to look at the plot, go through the basic outline, and honestly, this story is just such a roller coaster, showing us different types of tension, different types of desperation that Abraham feels, and the most important part of the story is what are we going to learn from God's characteristic about who He really is in different areas. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump right in, and yeah, let's just put the setting out as most of you know this story. But I want to see how you guys can put yourselves in the midst of this story and see how God can speak to you through it, and how we can learn about different characteristics that He has for us. So yeah, let's just go ahead and dive in. And so I have a couple questions for you guys. What are you desperate about? What breaks your heart? And where do you wish God would show His mercies and righteousness and love? And leading into that, have you ever wanted to see God's love, His compassion for a certain person, a certain social justice issue, or an event in life, and struggled to see God within the midst of that? And I think here today, as we dive into this story, this is so desperate or so essential for us, as we even see with COVID-19 and all the desperation that's going around. People suffering financially, people are in poverty, people are dealing with issues of sickness and brokenness, and ultimately people dealing with this idea of mortality. And that's finally hitting them for the first time as people realize that life is fragile. And so we're going to dive in here. And so I just have a quick quote for you guys that I want to share with you. Just about exploring this issue, this conflict of being desperate and inviting God into your desperation and allowing Him to speak into your life. And so this quote is, "The power of our prayers lies not primarily in our effort and striving or in any technique, but rather in our knowledge of God." It's a Timothy Keller quote from his book Prayer. And my question to you guys is this true? Is the power of our prayer, it doesn't lie in our effort, in our striving, or in any technique, but in our knowledge of God? Is that true? Is knowing the character of God really all it takes to get what we are looking for from God in prayer? And I just see this area of brokenness, and we see here in this passage we're going to read today that it addresses an area of our need for a Redeemer. This story shows us that God deeply cares about our brokenness and His righteous judgment for sin. Yet this story also shows us another side of God, a side of God that most people don't think is in the Old Testament, and a side of God that shows mercy, patience, and love and righteousness. A side of God that shows characteristics that sometimes people don't even think God can have, and that would argue against them. And so what we'll do is I'm just going to dive in and read the story here, and we're going to go from there. So we're going to be in Genesis 18, verses 16 to 33. And you can join me in your Bible. "When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, 'Shall I hide from Abraham what am I about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations of the earth will be blessed by him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him.' Then the Lord said, 'The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see with my own eyes what they have done is just as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know.' The men turned away and went down towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached the Lord and said, 'Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in this city? Will you not sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of the whole entire earth do what is right?' Then the Lord said, 'If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake.' Then Abraham spoke up again, 'Now that I have been so bold, God, as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. Once again he spoke to him. What if only 40 are found there? Abraham said, now that I have been as bold to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there? In both times the Lord said, for the sake of the 30, the sake of the 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. So, I think in this story we see a couple different things of God's characteristic and how we can approach him in intercessory prayer. And so my question to begin this next part is, how can I find or recognize God's mercy, compassion, and righteousness in times of desperation? And so I want to talk about the area and the location of this story, as we've seen that we've gone through the Garden of Eden and so many different events. And so this story is literally almost right at the beginning of the Bible, as there's only been 15 chapters before this. And so already we can see that God is desperate to know and love his people and to treat sin equally and just to judge it for what it is. And so here, I want to explore some different areas of God's mercy, as you're going to see this theme of mercy, compassion, and righteousness. And so for this area of mercy, I have a couple different areas in the Bible where we see that. Saul, now Paul, and we can see that God could have ended his life for his persecution of Christians, but Paul repented and became one of the New Testament's most influential writers. That is mercy. And so we're also going to see this idea of compassion in this story, as I said. And an area of compassion that I see in the scriptures are the sin and cruelty of Nineveh had gone long enough when God decided to judge them. He sent Jonah beforehand, however, and to preach to them God's thoughts. And the Ninevites actually repented. God therefore held off his judgment with compassion. God had compassion for those people in Nineveh when we could even see that Jonah didn't really even want anything to do with them, but he had to obey God. And then we see God's righteousness, and we see God's righteousness right after the story as God destroys Sodom, even after Abraham desperately asked God to spare the city. God still decided to destroy the city because he couldn't find 10 righteous people, if you guys know the next chapter of this. And that's righteousness in a sense that God demands righteousness, and he will punish sin. So I want to break down the story a little bit with you guys so we can see the tension here. And so from verses 16 to 22, Abraham experiences these 3 character traits of God when God said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. Here we see mercy, righteousness, and love is going to be playing out. And so here in the story, we see how God is teaching Abraham about his different character traits. He is teaching him through how he invites Abraham into his deepest thoughts. God tells Abraham about how he will bless his descendants and the generations after him. And then he shares with Abraham about the terrible things that are happening in Sodom. God hears the cries from Sodom, and it is breaking his heart. Abraham absorbs this information and does what he is called to do. He uses his blessing towards the nations in intercessory prayer. So, in our next part of this is, what will Abraham do? God has shared with him this insight into his deepest thoughts about how the people are crying out to him. And I'm just going to read that section just so we can be in the scriptures here from verses 16 to 22. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about Abraham what he has promised him. And then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see what they have done is just as bad as the cries that have reached me. If not, I will know. Then the men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. And so, yeah, what is Abraham going to do, and how does he respond to this insight from God? Now, to put you in this situation, if God just told you about his thoughts and his insights, how would you respond? We see in stories all the time where we put ourselves in the actor's role, and because we want to identify with them, and we almost want to test our own personalities in a sense, right? So this is what I want you guys to do, is I want to put you guys in this situation, and if God told you about his thoughts and insights, how would you respond? This story puts into perspective for me as I reflect on the bold actions of Abraham and how he took to meet God in desperation. Abraham responded in a way where you could tell he was compassionate. He wanted God to treat the righteous people differently than the wicked. And this is how we're going to see it play out in this next verse as we read verses 23 to 25. Then Abraham approached him and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous with the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do what is right?" And so for 3 verses, Abraham pleads out with God, essentially asking God to not kill the righteous with the wicked people. And, looking at this part of the story, this seems like the fair thing to do if you knew that God was possibly thinking about destroying a city that you have family in, because we know that the story is called Abraham interceding for Lot. And so we have this history of Lot being in this city from Genesis 14. And again, we see this through the eyes of Abraham. God has said that through him, all of the nations of the world will be blessed. And we see here that God was teaching Abraham a lesson. And possibly in this story, could that be true? Maybe it's true, but more clearly we see that God has called out Abraham, who has enough compassion to intercede with God himself for the life of Lot and of the people of Sodom. So again, we see here how God has been working in Abraham. Abraham knows God and knows his character. And we see that with how specific he is crying out to God for the potential righteous people in Sodom. Timothy Keller in his book Prayer writes, "The power of our prayers lies not primarily in our efforts and striving or in any technique, but rather in our knowledge of God." This is Abraham. He knows that God's heart is breaking for Sodom and knows that, and he deeply knows that. Abraham sees that God has deep compassion for the righteous and the unrighteous in the city. And so here we are in this part of the story. Abraham has just poured out his heart to God. But what Abraham said, was it enough? Can one man really change the outcome of an entire city? I believe the answers to this are be found in verses 26 to 33. And so let's go ahead and let's read the end of the story here. The Lord said, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke up again, "Now that I have been so bold to speak out to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? And if I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again he spoke to him. "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will do it. I will not do it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there?" He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, "Now that I have been so bold to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?" He said, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then Abraham said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. If only 10 can be found there." He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. And so, in this part of the story, this third section, we see God's love for Abraham on full display as we see how he responds to Abraham in patience and compassion 5 separate times. The response that God gives to Abraham is utterly amazing. God tells Abraham that he will spare Sodom if 50 people are found. What? God is listening to Abraham. It's amazing. And so here we get this tension, and then we realize Abraham is realizing that there's probably not 50 righteous people in Sodom. Abraham came to God in humility, as we see in verse 27, and he is aware of his humanity through Abraham saying that he is essentially dust. He acknowledges that he has come boldly to the Lord. And this is powerful. And this is where we see Abraham is acknowledging the characteristics of God through his own humanness, right? He knows that he is just dust. He knows that he is just ashes, but he knows the power of the Lord. And we see through that God's answer is God is sharing his deepest thoughts with him, right? And so the power of our prayers lies not primarily in our effort and striving or in any technique, but rather in our knowledge of God. And this is where the quote plays out. God agrees with Abraham and continues to listen to him as Abraham boldly asks God, if 40, if 30, if 20, if 10 righteous people are found, will you spare the city? And so the resolution of the story is that God says, for the sake of 10 people, I will not destroy it. Here rests the answer to approaching God in boldness and desperation, as we see here that Abraham has successfully changed what God was going to do, right? I don't think that this is quite the right way to look at this. Looking at this story, I believe that Abraham influenced the decision God was going to make in interceding for Lot in the city of Sodom. Because we see here that Abraham knows that God is a merciful God. He knows that God is a compassionate God. But he has to be aware that God is a righteous God. And so we are invited into this story because we can see that we as God's children can be part of the decisions God makes through the process of interceding and knowing the attributes and characteristics of God. And then in this story, we also see the great patience and understanding of God. We see God continue to allow Abraham to work out his request with God, and God continuing to grant his requests. In God inviting Abraham to be a part of his thought process, Abraham in return wanted to see the city not face judgment. And I think this is such a crucial part as we see in this story, as a lot of the times our human agenda is we want to see God answer our prayers in times of desperation. But the divine agenda that God has for us is he wants to see his characteristics of compassion, mercy, and righteousness and love. And he wants us to see it, how we can communicate with him in our times of desperation and prayer. And I think ultimately that's the amazing part of this story, is Abraham knowing his humanness, knowing his stance, knowing how God is going to be blessing him through all the nations, and Abraham kneeling before God in desperation and compassion. And I think about this story and the redeeming aspect of this. And this story points to Jesus in the simple fact that the world is in need of a Savior. For us to even come to God, we need someone that is willing to stand in the gap for our sin. This story invites us into communion with God the Father on a daily basis, and it shows us that with deep persistence and in our desperation, God is willing to listen to us and consider our requests. We might not always get what we want, but it might be for our own good, for his ways are not our ways. Thanks, guys.